The stars had always been kind to Elena Mercer. She used to say that when she was a little girl, lying flat on the roof of her grandmother's house in Cedar Falls, Iowa, with her arms stretched wide and her eyes fixed on the endless dark sky above her, she would count the stars one by one, whispering their names as if they were old friends who had come to visit. Orion, Cassiopeia, Andromeda, the Pleiades. She gave them nicknames too, the ones that the books hadn't assigned yet. She called the brightest star in the south Henry, after her grandfather, because it burned steady and strong and never flickered even when storms rolled in from the west. She called the soft blue one near the horizon Mama, because it was gentle, and it always came back after the long winter nights hid it away for months. The stars had always been kind to Elena Mercer, right up until the night they stopped being kind to everyone else. She was 34 years old when the first signal came in. 34 years old, a senior communications officer at the Unified Earth Signal Station in northern Canada, sitting at her desk with a half-eaten granola bar and a cold cup of coffee, when every single screen in the building lit up at the same time. The lights flickered. The backup generators kicked on with a deep mechanical groan. The coffee in her mug shook in tiny ripples, like something enormous had passed through the air without touching it. Elena set down her granola bar. She looked at the screens. Every single one of them was filled with the same pattern. A rhythmic, repeating pulse that moved in waves across the displays, blue and white and almost beautiful if you didn't know what you were looking at. But Elena knew. She had studied signal theory for 11 years. She had written her doctoral thesis on non-human communication patterns found in deep space frequencies. She had spent the last 6 years at this station listening, really listening, to the universe the way most people never bothered to do. She knew exactly what she was looking at. "Oh," she said softly. "Just that." Just one small word, breathed out into the quiet room, while the rest of the station's night crew slowly began to wake up around her, drawn from their stations and their break rooms and their cots by the sound of the alarms that had started going off, one after another, like dominoes falling in slow motion across the building. Oh. It was first contact. Not the gentle, poetic kind that scientists had dreamed about for centuries. Not a faint mathematical signal from a distant star system that would take decades to decode. This was immediate. This was close. This was a broadcast that was being directed specifically at Earth, from something that was already inside the solar system, already past the orbit of Jupiter, already moving with a speed and purpose that made Elena's hands go cold as she pulled up the trajectory data on her secondary screen. Whatever was sending this signal was not passing by. It was coming here. The next 72 hours were the most chaotic of Elena's life, and she had lived through the Brisbane floods of 2041 and the food riots in Central Europe the following summer. Every government on Earth was on the line. Every military satellite was repositioned. Every major telescope on the planet was aimed at the same point in the sky, a point that shifted slightly every hour as the object moved closer, steady and unhurried, as if it had all the time in the universe and was simply choosing to spend some of it on Earth. Elena didn't sleep. She barely sat down. She worked at her station for 36 hours straight, her fingers moving across the keyboards with a kind of focused urgency that she had never felt before in her life, translating, cross-referencing, mapping the signal against every known pattern in the deep space frequency database she had spent 6 years building. The rest of the team worked around her. Coffee appeared at her elbow and disappeared. Someone brought her a sandwich at some point and she ate half of it without looking away from the screens. By the end of the second day she had something. Not a full translation. Not even close. But a framework. A structural map of the signal that showed its internal logic, the way it repeated and varied and built on itself. It was a language. A complex, layered, almost musical language that operated on at least 4 simultaneous channels of meaning. And buried inside it, wrapped in repetition the way a gift is wrapped in paper, was something she could read. She could read it because it was written in numbers. Mathematical constants. Prime sequences. Geometric ratios. The universal language that every scientist since Carl Sagan had theorized would be the key to first contact. And here it was, right here, real and present and terrifying and magnificent. And Elena Mercer sat in front of it at 3 a.m. with tears running silently down her face because she had spent her whole life believing this moment would come, and now that it had arrived she felt, more than anything else, completely and utterly alone. She pressed her hand flat against the screen. She took a breath. And then she got back to work. By hour 58, the signal had been decoded enough to understand its basic structure. By hour 63, the United Nations Emergency Council had been briefed. By hour 71, every world leader had received the classified summary document that Elena had drafted herself, in plain language, without softening any of it, because she believed that if this moment meant anything at all, it meant that humanity deserved to hear the truth. The signal was a greeting. But it was also a demand. The beings aboard the approaching vessel, beings who called themselves the Vorith, or at least that was the closest approximation Elena could construct from their phonetic encoding, were members of something they referred to as the Interstellar Council, a governing body. A coalition of 37 intelligent species spread across a region of the galaxy roughly 400 light-years in diameter. They had been aware of Earth for some time. They had been watching. And now they had decided that humanity had reached a sufficient level of development to be formally acknowledged. This was, on the surface, wonderful. What was not wonderful, what made Elena's stomach drop when she finally decoded it at hour 71, sitting alone at her station in the pale blue light of the screens, was the rest of the message. Acknowledgement, according to the Vorith, came with a price. Every species that was recognized by the Interstellar Council was required to pay what they called the founding tribute, a transfer of resources, technology, and biological data that served as the entry fee into the galactic community. The tribute was not negotiable. It had never been refused. The 37 species that currently made up the council had all paid it, some willingly, some less so. The ones who had refused, and the signal listed 3. By name, in what felt to Elena like a deliberate and pointed way, no longer existed. The Vorith would arrive in orbit around Earth in 9 days. They expected an answer on day 10. Elena read the decoded message 3 times. Then she saved it, encrypted it, flagged it for immediate distribution to the UN Emergency Council, and sat very still for a long moment with her hands in her lap and her eyes closed. She thought about her grandmother's roof in Cedar Falls. She thought about Henry and Mama, the stars she had named when she was 8 years old. She thought about what it meant to look up at something beautiful and only later realize it was looking back. Then she opened her eyes, picked up her cold coffee, took a sip, and said very quietly to no one in particular, HFY, from this moment, everything changes. She didn't know then how right she was. She didn't know that the 9 days between that moment and the arrival of the Vorith vessel would reshape her entirely, not just as a scientist, not just as an officer, but as a human being. She didn't know that somewhere out there, somewhere in the political machinery that was already spinning up around her decoded message, a man named James Callaway was reading her words for the first time, and feeling something shift in his chest that he could not yet name. She didn't know any of that. She just knew the stars. And for now that would have to be enough. The 9 days passed the way emergencies always do, in a blur of too much information and too little sleep, of meetings that lasted until midnight and decisions that were made in rooms Elena was not invited into, of press releases that said almost nothing and classified briefings that said almost everything, in the strange, disorienting sensation of living at the exact center of the most important event in human history while simultaneously feeling completely peripheral to it. She filed her reports. She answered her questions. She continued to work on the signal, refining her translation, filling in the gaps in her understanding of the Vorith language with the obsessive patience that had always been her greatest professional strength and her greatest personal inconvenience. She ate when she remembered to. She slept in 4-hour stretches on the cot in her office. She called her mother twice, brief, careful calls in which she said nothing specific, and her mother somehow seemed to understand everything, the way mothers always did. On day 5, a man she had never met walked into her office. He was tall, genuinely tall, the kind of tall that was noticeable even in a room with a high ceiling. He had dark hair that was slightly too long for military regulation and a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of something sturdy and patient. He was wearing a suit that fit well but not expensively, and he carried a single manila folder that he held flat against his side like it was something he intended to guard. He had gray eyes, not cold gray but the soft, complicated gray of clouds before rain, the kind of gray that you could look at for a long time without getting tired of it. He knocked on her open door. "Dr. Mercer?" he said. His voice was calm. Not the performance of calm that people used in crisis situations, the deliberate lowering and steadying of the voice to signal control. It was actually calm, a real, settled, present calm that came from somewhere deeper than training. Elena looked up from her screens. "That depends," she said, "on whether you're here to tell me something helpful or something political." He blinked. Then, slowly, he smiled, just slightly, just at one corner of his mouth, as if he was checking to make sure it was appropriate before letting it fully form. "Hopefully the former," he said. "I'm James Callaway. I've been appointed as the UN's lead diplomatic coordinator for the Vorith contact situation. I've read every report you've filed in the last 5 days, Dr. Mercer. All of them. Twice most of them." Elena leaned back in her chair. "Then you know we're in trouble," she said. Yes, he said simply. I do. She studied him for a moment. There was something about his directness that she found unexpectedly refreshing, like cold water after a long time in the heat. Most of the officials and military personnel who had come through her office in the last 5 days had wrapped everything in careful language, qualification upon qualification, the diplomatic bubble wrap of institutional communication. This man had simply agreed with her. Sit down, Mr. Callaway, she said. He sat. And that was the beginning of everything. James Callaway had not planned to become a diplomat. He had planned at various points in his life to become a marine biologist, a high school history teacher, a carpenter, and for one brief and embarrassing semester at college, a jazz musician. What he had actually become was none of these things, and somehow, in the strange way that life works, all of them at once. He understood systems the way a biologist understood ecosystems, as living things with their own internal logic, their own predators and prey, their own delicate balances. He explained complicated things the way a good history teacher did, by finding the human story inside them. He was patient and precise and methodical with his thinking the way a carpenter was with his hands. And he listened the way a musician listened, not just to the notes that were being played but to the space between them, the silence that gave the music its shape. He had spent 12 years in the UN's diplomatic corps, the last 4 of which had been devoted to what his colleagues privately called impossible situations, conflicts and negotiations that had been declared unresolvable by every previous attempt, that were handed to James Callaway the way a jammed mechanism was handed to the one person in the room who was known to have unusually patient hands. He had mediated 3 territorial disputes in the South China Sea. He had negotiated the return of cultural artifacts between 6 countries and 4 non-state entities. He had spent 11 days in a conference room in Geneva working through a water rights agreement between nations that had been threatening armed conflict over the issue for 2 decades. He had never failed to reach an agreement. He had also never, in all of those 12 years, faced anything like this. The Vorith situation was not a conflict between human parties who shared, however imperfectly, a common framework of values and needs. The Vorith were genuinely alien, not just in biology or culture but in the fundamental architecture of how they organized their world. The interstellar council they represented was, as far as James could determine from Elena's decoded messages and the additional material that had come in over the days since, a deeply hierarchical structure built around the principle of demonstrated power. Species paid the founding tribute not simply because they were required to, but because paying it was the act that established their position in the hierarchy. To pay the tribute was to acknowledge the council's authority. To pay it promptly and fully was to demonstrate compliance. To pay it without protest was, and this was the part that kept James awake at night, to establish permanently and on record that your species had submitted. He had read Elena's reports twice each because he needed to understand not just what she was saying but how she was saying it. The way she framed things. The precision of her language. The places where her scientific objectivity gave way just slightly to something more personal. A sharpness in the phrasing, a choice of word that carried more weight than a technical report strictly required. He found those moments the most useful because they told him where the pressure points were. Where the decision was not just logistical but moral. He found Elena Mercer in her reports to be one of the most honest thinkers he had ever read. When he walked into her office on day 5, he had expected a scientist, methodical, possibly defensive about her work, probably exhausted and possibly resentful of the political apparatus that had descended on her station in the wake of her discovery. What he had not expected was the way she looked at him when he walked in, not with suspicion or weariness, but with the direct, evaluating focus of someone who was genuinely trying to understand what they were seeing. Like she was reading him the same way she read signals. He liked it immediately. He sat down across from her desk and opened his folder and they talked for 3 hours. Not about politics. Not about logistics. About the Vorith, their language, their structure, their history as Elena had been able to piece it together from the signal. About the 3 species that the signal had named as having refused the tribute, the ones that no longer existed. About what that meant. About whether it meant what it sounded like it meant. I think it does, Elena said at about hour 2, when James had circled back to that question for the 3rd time. She was sitting forward in her chair now, her elbows on the desk, her coffee gone cold again beside her. I've looked at the syntactical structure around those 3 names 6 different ways. There's no ambiguity. The phrase they use, the one I've translated as, no longer existed, it's in a completed past tense that has a specific marker attached to it. A marker that appears in one other context in the signal. She paused. When they describe the elimination of what they call disruptive elements within their own membership. James was quiet for a moment. So when they say those 3 species no longer exist, he said carefully, they mean the council made sure of it, Elena said. She didn't look away from him when she said it. Her voice was level, but her hands, James noticed, were very still. Yes. He nodded slowly. Then we have a problem, he said. We have several problems, Elena said. The tribute itself is one. The resources they're demanding, I'll have the full breakdown for you by tomorrow morning, but even the preliminary numbers are significant. Years of scientific data. Biological samples. Raw materials. It's not insurmountable, but it's not small. The bigger problem is what the tribute means. If we pay it, we've told them something about ourselves. Something we can't take back. That we comply under pressure. That we comply when threatened, Elena corrected precisely. That's different. Compliance under social pressure is one thing. Compliance under existential threat is a statement of fundamental character. If they've done this with 37 species, they've built a very detailed picture of how coercion works on intelligent life. And we will have confirmed that it works on us the same way it worked on everyone else. James looked at her for a long moment. You've thought about this a lot, he said. I haven't stopped thinking about it since hour 71, she said. Since I finished decoding the message. She leaned back slightly. Have you? Since I read your first report, he said honestly. Something shifted in her expression, just slightly, just for a moment. A softening at the edges that she seemed to catch and correct almost immediately, reassembling her professional composure with a small, precise movement of her shoulders. What's the UN's current position? She asked. James set his folder flat on the desk. The UN's current position, he said, is that we have 4 days to figure out what our position is. That's not a position. No, he agreed. It's not. What's your position, Mr. Callaway? He was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the small high window of Elena's office, the Canadian sky was dark and full of stars. He looked at them briefly, just for a second, just a glance, and then looked back at her. I think, he said slowly, that the most dangerous thing we could do right now is assume that the only options are compliance and extinction. Elena stared at him. Then she said, say that again. He did. And Elena Mercer, who had been running on adrenaline and black coffee and the particular fuel of intellectual obsession for 5 days, felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of anxious, isolated certainty that she had been carrying alone since hour 71, loosen and begin slowly to ease. Most people who've come through that door, she said carefully, have been operating from a binary. Pay or die. Submit or be eliminated. And I understand why. The signal is explicit about what happened to the species that refused. But I keep thinking. She stopped. What do you keep thinking? James asked. I keep thinking about the language, she said. About the way they've constructed this message. It's very calculated. It's designed to produce a specific response. The listing of the eliminated species, right there in the greeting signal, before we've even had a chance to formulate a reply. That's not information. That's a threat delivered in the language of information. And threats that are delivered that carefully, that precisely, that early in a negotiation. She paused again. They're worried about something, James said quietly. Elena pointed at him. They're worried about something, she confirmed. Or they wouldn't need to threaten us before we'd even had a chance to refuse. You don't walk into a negotiation leading with your most extreme leverage unless you're not sure your other leverage is sufficient. James Callaway leaned forward in his chair. Outside, the stars burned cold and steady in the dark Canadian sky. Dr. Mercer, he said, I think we need to work together. I think so too, Mr. Callaway, she said. She extended her hand across the desk. He took it. It was a professional handshake. Firm, brief, appropriate. But James held it for just a fraction of a second longer than strictly necessary, and Elena felt the warmth of it in her fingers for a long time after he had let go. The next 4 days were the most intellectually intense of James Callaway's life, and he had once spent 2 weeks alone in a conference room in Geneva essentially rebuilding international water law from foundational principles. He and Elena worked together every day, sometimes in her office, sometimes in the larger briefing room down the hall, sometimes at the long table in the station's main operations center with screens on 3 walls showing the approaching Vorith vessel and the real-time updates from Elena's signal analysis team. They worked well together in the way that certain people work well together. Not because they agreed on everything but because they disagreed precisely and usefully, each one's thinking sharpening against the others the way a blade sharpens against a whetstone. Elena would say, here is what the language tells us about their structure. James would say, And here is what that structure means in terms of negotiation leverage. Elena would say, but look at this anomaly in the signal pattern. It suggests a dissenting faction within their delegation. James would say, which means our position could be addressed to the dissenters rather than the consensus. Elena would say, that's extraordinarily risky if I've misread the pattern. James would say, everything about this situation is extraordinarily risky. The question is which risks are worth taking. And around they went, building something together that neither of them could have built alone. A picture of the Vorith that was both linguistically precise and strategically mapped, a portrait of their psychology and their motivations drawn from the signal data and James's 12 years of reading the hidden architecture of how intelligent beings negotiated power. They were not friends, not yet. They were colleagues in a crisis, bound together by the urgency of an impossible deadline. But something was building between them in the margins of the work, in the brief silences when they had both run out of words, in the small moments of shared recognition when one of them said something that the other had been thinking, in the way James always made sure her coffee was hot when he refilled his own, and the way Elena always noticed when he had been staring at the same screen for too long and asked a question that redirected his focus without making it obvious that she had done so. Deliberately. On day 8, the day before the Vorith vessel entered Earth orbit, they worked until 3 in the morning and then sat in exhausted silence in the operations center while the night crew moved quietly around them. Can I ask you something personal? Elena said. James looked over at her. She was sitting sideways in her chair with her legs crossed and her head tipped back slightly, looking at the main screen where the Vorith vessel showed as a moving light among the fixed stars. Yes, he said. Why does it matter to you? Not the job. Not the mission. You. She looked at him. Why does it matter to you personally that we don't just pay the tribute and move on? He thought about it for a moment. Genuinely thought about it, rather than reaching for the prepared answer, the official answer, the diplomatic answer. Because I've spent 12 years watching what happens when people make decisions out of fear, he said at last. When they accept a bad arrangement because the alternative feels unsurvivable, and they tell themselves it's pragmatic, it's realistic, it's the best they can do. And sometimes it is the best they can do. Sometimes the power differential is real and the only thing you can do is survive it and build from there. But sometimes, he paused. Sometimes the power differential is a performance. Sometimes the other side needs you to believe you have no options because that belief is the only thing that makes their position work. Elena was quiet for a moment. You think that's what this is, she said. A performance. I think, he said carefully, that a civilization advanced enough to cross the stars is also advanced enough to know that destroying civilizations creates enemies. And that they've built a 37-species coalition, which means they are very, very good at making deals. Which means they have reasons to make this deal work beyond simple coercion. He looked at the moving light on the screen. I think the tribute is real. I think the threat is real. But I also think there's a conversation they're willing to have that they haven't shown us yet. And I think the key to accessing that conversation is not showing them fear. What do you show them instead? Elena asked. He looked at her. Humanity, he said simply. She looked back at him for a long moment. Get some sleep, Mr. Callaway, she said quietly. James, he said. A beat. Get some sleep, James, she said. He smiled, that small, careful smile she had already learned to watch for. You too, Elena, he said. The Vorith vessel entered Earth orbit at 6:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on the 9th day. Elena watched it arrive. She was standing in the operations center of the signal station, surrounded by her team and a roomful of UN observers and military personnel and scientists from a dozen different countries who had been assembled at the station over the past week, and she watched the main screen as the vessel came into range of the deep space optical array and resolved from a moving light into something she could actually see. It was beautiful. She had not expected that. She had expected something utilitarian, something that communicated function and power and nothing else. What she saw was a vessel that was enormous, genuinely enormous, dwarfing anything humanity had ever built by an order of magnitude that made her breath catch, but that was also unmistakably elegant. Its surface was dark and smooth and faintly iridescent, catching the sunlight in shifting patterns that moved across its hull like light on deep water. Its shape was not the angular, aggressive geometry of military design. It was curved and organic, almost biological, as if it had been grown rather than built. It's beautiful, said a voice beside her. She turned. James was standing a few feet away, watching the screen with the same expression she suspected was on her own face, a complicated mixture of awe and fear and something that was neither, something that had no name in the ordinary vocabulary of human experience. Yes, she said. It is. He looked at her briefly. "How are you?" "Terrified," she said. "You?" "The same," he said. They stood together in silence for a moment, watching the vessel settle into its orbital position. A vast, graceful object against the blue curve of the Earth, hanging in the sky with the casual certainty of something that belonged there. "We have one day," James said quietly. "One day," Elena confirmed. He nodded. "Then let's use it." What happened in the 24 hours between the vessel's arrival and the scheduled response deadline was, Elena would later say, the most important day in human history. Not the day of the response itself, that came after, but this day, this long, complicated, exhausting, extraordinary day, when humanity had to decide collectively and with breathtaking speed who it actually was. The decision was not made in one room. It was made simultaneously in hundreds of rooms across the planet, UN chambers and national parliaments and scientific councils and military command centers, and, crucially, in the global conversation that erupted across every channel of human communication the moment the vessel's arrival was publicly confirmed. Because the decision had been made early in the 9-day period to tell the truth. To tell the people of Earth what was happening, what was being demanded, and what the stakes were. It had been a deeply controversial decision. Half the council had argued against it, but James had advocated for it with a quiet, implacable certainty that had eventually carried the room. If we're going to represent humanity in this moment, he had said, we need to know what humanity actually thinks. And we can't know that if we make the decision in secret. So the world knew. And the world reacted, with fear, yes, and with anger, and with the full spectrum of human irrationality that always accompanied the proximity of existential threat. But also with something else. With a kind of fierce, complicated, entirely human dignity that expressed itself in 100 different ways across 100 different cultures. As protest, as prayer, as art, as argument, as the specific stubbornness of people who had been told they had no choice and who had decided, collectively and without coordination, that they did not accept this framing. The global conversation was not a consensus. It was never going to be a consensus. Humanity was too large and too various for that. But in the noise and the argument and the fear and the defiance, Elena and James and their team found what they had been looking for. They found the human word. It was Elena who identified it first, at about 2 in the morning on the day of the response deadline, while she was working through a batch of signal analysis that had been running overnight. She found it in the Vorith language itself, buried deep in the signal's 4th channel, the one she had labeled contextual relational, in her initial analysis, the channel that didn't carry demands or information but something subtler, something she had been struggling to categorize for days. She had thought it was emotional tone, the alien equivalent of vocal expression, the coloring of the communication rather than its content. But as she worked deeper into the structure, cross-referencing the 4th channel elements against the patterns she had identified in channels 1 through 3, she realized it was something different. It was a question. A very specific question, asked with great care in a layer of the signal that was designed to be difficult to find. Not hidden exactly, hidden would imply they didn't want it found. More like, placed. Set aside. Reserved for the recipient who had the skill and patience to look for it. She stared at it for a long time. Then she called James. He was there in 4 minutes, still pulling on his jacket, his hair slightly disordered from what she suspected had been a brief and insufficient attempt at sleep. He came through the door of the analysis room and looked at her and said, "What did you find?" She showed him. He stood over her shoulder and looked at the screen for a long time. "Say it in English," he said. She had been working on the translation for the past hour. She turned in her chair and looked up at him. "The closest translation I can get," she said carefully, "is something like, 'Does your kind know what it is?'" James stared at her. "What does that mean?" he said. In context, Elena turned back to the screen, pulling up the relational maps she had built around the phrase. In context, I think it means, do humans have a self-concept? Do you understand your own nature? Do you know what makes you distinct? She paused. I think it's a genuine question. I think someone in that delegation, maybe more than one someone, is genuinely curious. About us. James was very still. That's the opening, he said quietly. I think so, Elena said. He straightened up, looked at the screen, looked at her. Then we know what to say tomorrow, he said. Do we? She said. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, moved through something complicated and landed somewhere quiet and certain. Yes, he said. We do. She looked at him. Tell me, she said. Not tonight, he said. Tonight I want you to sleep. Actually sleep, 4 hours minimum. Because tomorrow you're going to need everything you have. She opened her mouth to object. "Elena," he said, and the gentleness in his voice stopped her. "Sleep. I'll be here when you wake up." She looked at him for a moment. Then she saved her work, locked her screens, and stood up. "For hours," she said. "For hours," he confirmed. She walked to the door. At the threshold she stopped and looked back at him. He was already sitting down at her station, pulling up the files, his focus settling over him like a cloak. "James," she said. He looked up. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. She went to sleep. She slept for exactly 4 hours and 12 minutes, which was the longest uninterrupted sleep she had had in 9 days, and when she woke up she felt, paradoxically, more afraid than she had the night before. Fear, she had learned, liked to collect itself during rest. While you were moving, working, pushing, it scattered. The moment you stopped, it caught up. She lay on the cot in her office for approximately 90 seconds, feeling the fear settle over her like cold water, and then she did what she had always done with fear. She got up and got to work. James was in the briefing room with 3 members of the UN communication team and Elena's lead signal analyst, a young woman named Dr. Priya Sharma who had been Elena's most trusted colleague for 3 years and who had the useful quality of being exactly as brilliant and somewhat more organized than Elena herself. They were working through a draft document, something James had been building overnight, and when Elena walked in they all looked up with the collective expression of people who had been awake for too long and were relying on each other to keep going. "Coffee's there," James said, pointing to the counter along the wall without looking up from his document. "And there's food. Someone brought actual food, not just granola bars." Elena poured coffee. She picked up a piece of toast and ate it standing at the counter, reading over Priya's shoulder at the draft on the screen. "Is this the response?" she said. "It's the framework for the response," James said. "We still need the word." Elena set down her toast. "Tell me your thinking," she said. James looked up. He was tired. Genuinely, visibly tired in a way that he hadn't allowed himself to show in the previous days, the weariness written in the lines around his eyes and the slight roughness of his voice. But under the tiredness there was something else. A focused, centered certainty that she recognized from the very first day they had met, when he had said, "I think the most dangerous thing we could do is assume our only options are compliance and extinction." The Vorith's message is built on a single premise, he said. That humanity is just another species. That we will react the way every other species has reacted, with fear, with self-preservation instinct, with the rational calculation that compliance now is better than extinction now. They've built their entire approach around this expectation. It's the foundation of their leverage. He paused. And the thing buried in Channel 4, the question you found, that's the crack in the foundation. Because someone in that delegation is not entirely certain that premise is correct. "They're uncertain about us," Elena said. "They're uncertain about us," James confirmed. And uncertainty in a negotiation is an opening. Not a solution, an opening. What we need to do in our response is not threaten them, we can't, our technology isn't remotely comparable, and not plead with them, that confirms their premise, but answer the question in Channel 4. He met Elena's eyes. "We need to tell them what we are." "And what are we?" Elena said. It was not a rhetorical question. She was genuinely asking. The room was quiet. Priya said carefully, "We're the species that, when we were told we had 9 days before possible extinction, spent those 9 days telling the truth to our own people. Publicly. On every channel." Everyone looked at her. Priya looked mildly self-conscious. That's what I keep coming back to. That decision. Most species probably wouldn't have done that. They would have kept it classified, made the decision centrally, maintained control of the narrative. We didn't. We told everyone. And then she gestured vaguely. We argued about it. Loudly. In public. And then we kept trying anyway. Elena was very still. "Priya," she said slowly, "say that again." Priya said it again. Elena turned to James. James was looking at Elena with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something layered and warm and very focused, like he was seeing something he had been hoping to see and was careful not to startle away. "That's it," Elena said. "That's it," he agreed quietly. She sat down. Pulled her notepad toward her. Started writing. "The word," she said, "isn't a word in English. Or in any human language. It's a demonstration. It's a fact. She wrote, crossed out, wrote again. "In the Vorith language, there's a term they use in Channel 3 for what I've been translating as legitimacy. The concept of a species having the right to its own continuance. But when I look at the components of the term, the submorphemes, the building blocks, one of them is a concept that appears 3 other times in the signal, always in the context of what I think are their highest order values. They're non-negotiables. She looked up. The concept translates roughly as coherence. The quality of a civilization being true to its own stated nature. Being who you say you are, James said. Being who you say you are, Elena confirmed. And what did we say we are 9 days ago when we decided to tell the truth? When we decided not to manage this, not to contain it, not to make the decision quietly in the dark. She set down her pen. We said we're a species that believes the people have a right to know. That the individuals making this decision are accountable to the billions of people whose lives it affects. That we don't, her voice shifted, went slightly rough. We don't decide for them. We decide with them. She stopped. The room was very quiet. Caro, said Priya softly. This is it. James looked at Elena. His expression was the most open she had seen it. The careful, measured quality he usually carried slightly lowered, something genuinely moved visible underneath. Can you say that in their language? He asked. I can try, Elena said. Then try, he said. Because I think that's the word. I think that's the one word that does what we need to do. Elena picked up her pen. She began to write. The response was transmitted at 11:47 a.m. Earth Standard Time, 13 minutes before the deadline. It was not a long transmission. It was not threatening. It was not pleading. It did not argue against the tribute. It did not enumerate Earth's military capabilities, which were negligible compared to what a 37-species interstellar coalition could bring to bear. It did not make promises that couldn't be kept or threats that couldn't be backed up. It was, at its core, a single word, a word constructed in the Vorith language from the components Elena had identified, a word that meant, approximately, the coherence of a civilization that is true to its own declared nature. A word that was, in the context of the Vorith value system as Elena had reconstructed it, one of the highest categories of recognition one civilization could extend to another. Followed by a sentence. One sentence, translated as precisely as Elena could manage, that said, "We told our people the truth. This is what we are. Decide whether this changes your terms." And then silence. James and Elena sat together in the operations center after the transmission was sent, in 2 chairs side by side, watching the screens that showed the Vorith vessel sitting in Earth orbit, vast and iridescent and utterly still. How long do you think they'll take to respond? James asked. I don't know, Elena said. What's your gut? She thought for a moment. Less than an hour, she said. Whatever they decide, they'll decide it quickly. Either the word lands and they respond, or it doesn't land and, she didn't finish the sentence. And we deal with what comes next, James said quietly. Yes. They sat in silence. Around them, the operations center hummed with the quiet, focused activity of people doing their jobs at the edge of the world's most important moment. Screens blinked and updated. Data moved. Coffee was quietly replenished. At some point, without either of them noticing it happen, James's hand had moved to rest beside Elena's on the arm of her chair. Not touching, just close. Just present. Just near. Elena looked down at it. She didn't move her hand. She looked back at the screens. 37 minutes after the transmission, the Vorith responded. The Vorith response came in at 12:24 p.m. It was not what anyone in the room had expected. It was not what anyone on Earth had expected, though most of Earth was watching by this point. The live feeds from the signal station were being broadcast simultaneously on every major channel on the planet, translated into 40 languages, watched by an estimated 4.7 billion people, which was the largest simultaneous global audience in the history of human communication. The response was silence. Not the silence of no response. The transmission indicators were active, the signal was coming through, Elena's screens were alive with incoming data. But the content of the transmission was, for approximately 40 seconds, silence. A deliberate silence, structured in a specific rhythmic pattern that Elena recognized immediately and that caused her to sit forward in her chair with a sharp intake of breath. That's channel 4, she said. James looked at her. What? The pattern, the rhythm of the silence. It's the same structural pattern as channel 4. The contextual relational channel. The question channel. Her fingers were moving across her keyboard, pulling up the analysis overlay, mapping the incoming silence against her stored channel 4 data. They're not responding in the demand register. They're not speaking through the voice that issued the tribute requirement. They're speaking through the... She stopped. Through the what? James said. Through the voice that asked the question, she said. The one that wanted to know if we knew what we were. She sat back. Her hands dropped to her lap. They're answering us from the same place we answered them. James stared at the screen. Is that good? Someone asked from behind them. One of the UN observers, a young man whose name Elena hadn't learned yet, who had been sitting quietly at the back of the room for most of the morning. James looked at Elena. Elena, he said. I think so, she said carefully. I think, she stopped again. The silence on the screen had shifted. A new pattern was emerging, building out of the structured quiet, a signal that was not the original tribute demand language but something else, something that Elena's analysis software flagged immediately as a variant of the fourth channel encoding, and she began to read it with the focused whole-body attention of someone who was not just translating words but hearing something she had been waiting her whole life to hear. She read it. She read it again. She pressed her hands flat on the desk and closed her eyes briefly. Elena, James said, and his voice was very quiet and very close, because at some point he had moved from his chair to stand beside her. What does it say? She opened her eyes. She turned to look at him, really look at him, directly, with none of the professional filtering she usually maintained, letting him see exactly what she was feeling in this moment, which was something so large and so complicated that she wasn't sure her face was physically capable of expressing all of it. It says, she said carefully, that the founding tribute, the full tribute as initially specified, has been suspended. The room erupted. Not in cheering, it wasn't that kind of news, not yet, not until they understood what suspended meant. But in the sudden collective release of 9 days of held breath, in voices rising and chairs scraping and the sound of the global feed cutting to reaction footage of crowds outside who had been watching on public screens, who had heard the word suspended in 40 languages simultaneously and were reacting with the dazed, unsteady relief of people who had been bracing for impact and found the ground still solid under their feet. James did not move. He stayed beside Elena's chair and looked at the screen. What else does it say? He asked. She looked back at the translation. It says, she continued, more quietly now, under the noise around them, so that essentially only James could hear her, that the Council has, I'll give you the most accurate translation I can, initiated a review process regarding the classification of the human species, in recognition of a demonstrated quality that has not been observed in any previous first contact species, the quality of, she stopped. The quality of what? James said. She looked at him. The quality they're describing is the one I've been calling coherence, she said. Being true to your declared nature. But they're not using the standard term for it. They're using an elevated form, a ceremonial form that I've only seen twice in the entire signal archive, both times in reference to species that hold the highest status within the Council. She paused. The closest translation I have for the elevated form is, I keep coming back to one word. She paused again. What word? James said. Integrity, she said. The room had gone quiet around them again. Not because people had stopped reacting but because something in the tone of their exchange, the quietness of it, the weight of it, had drawn everyone's attention in without their knowing it. James looked at Elena for a long moment. We did it, he said softly. Not completely, she said. The tribute is suspended, not cancelled. The review process, I don't know how long it takes or what it involves or what outcome it can produce. There's still a great deal we don't know. But we did it, he said again. Not dismissing her caution, honoring it and saying this alongside it, two true things at once. She looked at him. Yes, she said. We did. He reached out, slowly, carefully, as if he was moving through something that required delicacy, and placed his hand over hers on the desk. Not as a gesture of triumph. As a gesture of recognition. She looked down at his hand over hers. Then she turned her hand over and held his. Around them, the operations center continued to move and buzz and react, 40 people doing the work of the most extraordinary moment in human history. Outside, 4.7 billion people were watching screens and holding each other and crying and arguing and praying and all the other things that humans did when something happened that was too large for any single response. And in the center of it, in 2 chairs in front of a bank of screens showing a beautiful alien vessel and a stream of decoded signal data, James Callaway and Elena Mercer held hands and looked at the stars. 3 weeks after the Vorith vessel's arrival, Elena Mercer was called to Geneva. She had expected this, had known in the rational part of her mind that tracked political inevitability the way it tracked signal patterns, that the moment the immediate crisis was resolved her role would shift from essential to inconvenient. She was a scientist who had stumbled into diplomacy. She had no official standing in the UN structure beyond her position as senior communications officer at a Canadian signal station. The fact that she had decoded the most important message in human history and co-authored the response that had, apparently, impressed an interstellar civilization enough to pause its tribute demands did not, technically speaking, Give her a seat at any official table. She packed her single bag. She had arrived at the station with one bag and had somehow managed not to accumulate much in the weeks since, and said goodbye to Priya and to the rest of her team, and tried very hard not to think about the fact that James had already been in Geneva for 4 days. He had gone first, called ahead of her to participate in the UN's preliminary planning sessions for what was being called the Council engagement process, the careful, slow-moving diplomatic machinery that was gearing up to manage the ongoing relationship with the Vorith and, through them, with the Interstellar Council. He had called her twice during those 4 days, once on a conference line with 3 other people, once briefly and privately late on the second night, just to ask how she was doing, and she had said fine and he had said good, and there had been a pause that was slightly too long for the word, fine, to be entirely convincing. She flew to Geneva in a UN charter with 6 other scientists and 2 government liaisons and spent the 7-hour flight reading the preliminary council engagement documentation and trying not to think about what she was flying toward, which was a situation she did not have a clear name for. She and James had not talked about it. There had been no moment in the 3 weeks since they had held hands in the operations center to have a conversation that was not about the Vorith or the translation or the response process or the council review or the 1,000 other urgent, consequential things that demanded their constant attention. They had continued to work together, sometimes in the same room, more often over secure video link as the diplomatic machinery began to distribute them to different locations. Their professional relationship had continued with exactly the focused efficiency it had always had. Nothing had changed in the work. But something had changed. Elena was not someone who talked herself out of things. She was too honest for that, too committed to calling what she saw by its accurate name. What had changed was that James Callaway had become necessary to her in a way that was not professional and not analytical and did not resolve under close examination into something she could categorize and file. She thought about him at odd moments, not constantly, not obsessively, but with a regularity and a warmth that she had not given anyone in a very long time. She noticed when he was tired. She noticed when he was choosing his words more carefully than usual, which was the tell that he was managing something difficult. She noticed the particular quality of his attention when she said something he had not expected, the way it sharpened and stilled, like a good reader encountering an unexpected sentence. She noticed these things and she filed them away and she kept working, because the work was what mattered and the world was possibly on the verge of entering a galactic community and there was genuinely no time for anything else. Or so she told herself at 34,000 feet over the Atlantic. Geneva was cold and gray and beautiful in the way that Geneva always was. The lake still and silver, the mountains beyond it sharp against the winter sky. Elena checked into her hotel, changed her clothes, went directly to the UN complex, and was immediately absorbed into a briefing session that lasted 4 hours and covered approximately 600 years' worth of diplomatic preparation in compressed and exhaustive detail. She saw James at the end of the briefing session. He was across the room when she first noticed him, standing with a small group of people she didn't recognize, talking with the particular focused economy of someone who was being very careful with a very important conversation. He was in a dark jacket. His hair was still slightly too long. He had a coffee cup in his left hand and his right hand was moving as he talked, a precise, contained gesture that she had learned meant he was making a specific point rather than building to one. He looked up and saw her. He excused himself from the group without any particular rush and walked across the room, and Elena stayed where she was and watched him come and thought, with the clarity that sometimes arrived at the worst possible moments. Ah, there it is. How was the flight? He said when he reached her. Long, she said. How's Geneva? Cold, he said. You should eat something. The briefing ran through dinner. I noticed. She looked at him. How are you? Better now, he said. And then he seemed to hear what he'd said, and something in his expression shifted, not away from it, but toward it, carefully, the way he always moved toward things that required delicacy. A long moment passed between them. James, she started. Elena, he started at the same moment. They both stopped. He looked at her with that complicated gray-eyed attention. There are approximately 8,000 things we need to discuss regarding the council engagement process, he said, and none of them are what I actually want to talk to you about right now. Elena looked at him steadily. What do you want to talk about? She said. I want to talk about whether the thing that's happening between us is something we're going to pretend isn't happening, he said, or something we're going to be honest about. Because I have a strong preference for the second option, but I'm aware that the situation is complicated and your work is the priority and I don't want to. James, she said. He stopped. It's not something I intend to pretend isn't happening, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Good, he said. That's good. They stood in the middle of the empty briefing room, the other participants had filtered out, and looked at each other in the way that people look at each other when they have said the most important thing and are still deciding what to say next. "Dinner?" he said. "Yes," she said. It was, as first moments go, extremely undramatic. But it was also, Elena thought, exactly right, exactly calibrated to who they both were, which was people who said what they meant and meant what they said and did not particularly require the dramatic gesture when the honest one was available. She picked up her jacket. They went to dinner. The council engagement process had been proceeding, in its careful and complicated way, for approximately 6 weeks when the second message from the Vorith arrived. Not from the vessel. The vessel had remained in Earth orbit throughout this period, present and watchful, neither threatening nor engaging, as if it was waiting for something specific before its next move. The second message came through the same frequency as the first, and Elena received the alert on her encrypted tablet at 3 in the morning in her Geneva hotel room, and she was dressed and at her workstation in the UN Communications Center within 12 minutes. Priya was already on the secure line from Canada, having also received the alert, and they worked together. Priya handling the technical extraction and Elena focusing on the structural analysis and translation, the way they had worked so many times in the previous weeks that their workflow had become almost wordless, each of them anticipating the other's needs without having to state them. It took 2 hours to decode the essential content of the message. It was not a demand. It was an invitation. The Council, having completed what they described as the first phase of their review of the human species, was requesting that a delegation from Earth travel to the Vorith vessel for a meeting. A formal meeting, structured according to Council protocols that they were providing in detailed appendices, between representatives of Earth and representatives of the Council's Review Committee. The meeting was described as a coherence hearing. Elena read this several times. "Priya," she said carefully. "In context, the coherence hearing. Do you have any sense of whether this is a test?" Priya said. "Yes." A pause on the line. "Yes," Priya said. "I think it's a test. A very specific test. And based on the structural framing of the invitation, the protocol specifications, the way they've described the composition of their committee, I think the test is not of our technology or our military capability or our resources." "What is the test of?" Elena said, though she suspected she already knew. "Of whether we are who we said we were," Priya said. In the response. "Whether what we demonstrated was," a pause, "real." Elena set down her tablet. She looked at the wall of her workstation for a moment. Then she called James. James arrived at the communications center in 19 minutes, which was faster than Elena had thought possible given that his hotel was a 15-minute walk from the complex and it was 3 in the morning. He came in the door with his jacket not fully on yet, pulling it over one shoulder, and looked at Elena across the room with the alert, gathered attention of someone who had been asleep and was now completely awake. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He stood still while she talked, the way he always did when he was listening to something important. Absolutely still, his full attention on her, the jacket finally settled on his shoulders but his hands hanging loose at his sides, not moving, not gesturing, just still. When she finished, he said, "A coherence hearing." "Yes." "They want to meet face to face." "On the vessel." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "And the delegation," he said. "Who do they specify?" Elena turned back to her screens and pulled up the relevant section of the decoded invitation. "They don't specify individuals. They specify criteria. The delegation must be composed of, I'll translate as precisely as I can, those who acted at the point of coherence. The ones who were directly involved in constructing the response." She paused. "James, I think they mean us." He looked at her. "Us specifically?" he said. "The people who built the transmission," she said. "You. Me. Priya possibly. The core team." She turned to face him fully. "They're not asking for heads of state. They're not asking for the people with the biggest titles or the most political authority. They're asking for the people who did the thing." She paused. "Who were true to our declared nature at the point of crisis." James moved, not toward his chair but toward the window. He stood looking out at the Geneva night, the lake invisible in the dark, the mountains only a faint suggestion against the clouds. "The UN won't like that," he said quietly. "No," Elena said. "They won't. They'll want to send a formal diplomatic delegation. Heads of state. Secretary General. Military representation. Probably. And if we send that delegation instead of the people the Vorith have asked for, then we fail the test before it starts," Elena said. "We demonstrate that we say one thing and do another. That our institutional structures override our stated values. That when it matters, we don't actually govern ourselves the way we claim to. She paused. We prove that the word we sent them was not true. James turned from the window. He looked at her with that steady, complicated attention. You know what you're saying, he said. I know exactly what I'm saying, she said. I'm saying that I think we need to argue, very clearly and very strongly, for a delegation composed of the people who actually built the response. Which means you and me and Priya and whoever else from the original team we can get clearance for. She met his eyes. And I'm saying that fighting for that in the UN political environment is going to be a battle, he said. Yes. Are you ready for that battle? He said. She looked at him steadily. I've been ready for battles my whole life, she said. Are you? That small, careful smile again at one corner of his mouth. Yes, he said. I think I am. The battle, as it turned out, took 8 days. 8 days of meetings and memos and arguments and counter-arguments, of political pressures and institutional resistance and the specific, grinding difficulty of convincing a large bureaucratic structure to make a decision that conflicted with its own interests. The Secretary General's office wanted to lead the delegation. 3 Security Council members wanted representation. The Military Advisory Committee wanted an observer. Everyone had a reason, a precedent, a protocol. James argued his case with the same patient, implacable calm he brought to everything. Elena argued hers with somewhat less patience and considerably more precision. She built her case on the linguistic data, the structural analysis of the Vorith invitation, the clear specification of the criteria the Council had used to describe the requested delegation. She made the argument not on emotional grounds but on logical ones. This is what they asked for, this is why they asked for it, this is what happens if we send something different. On the 7th day, James was called before the Secretary General's office alone. He was in the meeting for 3 hours. Elena paced her hotel room for those 3 hours, trying to work and failing, her mind fixed on what was happening in that room, on whether the argument she and James had built together was going to be enough. When he came back, he called her before he was out of the building. We got it, he said. She sat down on the edge of her bed. All of it, she said. The core team. You, me, Priya, and 3 members of your signal analysis unit, plus 1 security officer. That was the compromise. 1 observer with no speaking authority. Pause. We lead. We speak. We represent. Elena was quiet for a moment. How did you convince them? She said. I used your argument, he said. The linguistic data. The structural analysis. But I added something. What? I told them, he said carefully, that if we failed this hearing, if the Council concluded that humanity was not what we demonstrated in our response, the political fallout for the Secretary General's office would be of a scale that no amount of correct protocol would mitigate. And if we passed it by sending exactly who the Council asked for, the credit would accrue to the entire institution regardless of who led the delegation. Pause. That's very political of you, Elena said. Yes, he said. Diplomacy frequently is. She laughed, a short, genuine laugh that surprised her, and apparently surprised him too, because there was a small silence on his end before he said, quietly and warmly, I like that sound. The words settled in the air between them, through the phone, across the Geneva night. James, she said. I know, he said. There will be time. After the hearing, she said. After the hearing, he confirmed. She closed her eyes briefly. Okay, she said. After. The shuttle that took them up to the Vorith vessel was not a human shuttle. It arrived on day 37, descending from the orbital vessel with a silence and grace that made every piece of human aviation technology that Elena had ever seen feel suddenly very loud and very clumsy by comparison. It landed in the field outside the UN complex in Geneva, a field that had been cleared and designated as a landing zone 3 days prior, and it sat there on the silver grass of a February morning, looking both alien and entirely natural, the way a stone looks natural in a riverbed even though it did not start there. Elena stood at the edge of the cleared zone with James beside her and Priya on her other side and the rest of their small team arrayed behind them, and she looked at the shuttle and she felt, for the first time since this had all begun, something that was not fear and not awe and not intellectual excitement but a complex mixture of all three and something else, something she couldn't name, something that felt like the moment before you say a word you've been thinking for a long time. Ready? James said beside her. No, she said honestly. You? No, he said. He glanced at her. Shall we go anyway? Yes, she said. They walked toward the shuttle. Up close, the material of its hull was extraordinary, not metal, not quite, something that seemed to breathe slightly as they approached, shifting its reflectivity in response to the angle and the movement of its visitors. There was no visible seam where the door should have been. There was no door as it turned out. The hull simply opened, a section of it flowing aside in a movement that was more liquid than mechanical, revealing an interior that was lit in a warm, amber-gold light that was close enough to natural sunlight to be comfortable. They boarded. The interior of the shuttle was large, larger than it looked from outside, which Elena's mind filed as either optical illusion or technology she didn't yet understand. The seating was not human furniture but something that functioned like it, low, curved surfaces that adjusted slightly when you sat, finding a position that was, in fact, surprisingly comfortable. The walls were smooth and warm to the touch, not cold like metal. The light moved slightly, cycling through slow, subtle variations that felt, Elena realized, like the rhythm of something breathing. They ascended in silence. No vibration. No noise. No sensation of movement except a very gradual, very gentle shift of perspective as Geneva fell away beneath them and the blue sky darkened to the deep indigo of the upper atmosphere and then, with a strange and beautiful abruptness, to the black of space. Elena pressed her hand against the wall beside her seat. Through a section of the hull that had become transparent at some point she couldn't identify, she could see the earth below, curved and blue and white and extraordinary, the way it always looked in photographs and yet entirely different when you were actually looking at it, actually here, actually moving away from it. She looked at it for a long time. James's hand found hers in the warm amber light of the shuttle. She held it. She did not look away from the earth. The Vorith vessel, when they entered it, was an entirely different experience from the shuttle. The shuttle had been designed, she suspected deliberately, to transition them gradually, to give them something between human familiar and fully alien. The vessel itself made no such concession. It was what it was, enormous and intricate and built according to an aesthetic logic that was entirely its own, and walking through it required a kind of sustained cognitive flexibility that Elena found both exhausting and exhilarating. The corridors were tall, very tall, suggesting the Vorith themselves were considerably larger than humans, and curved in ways that were not quite intuitive to human spatial processing, so that you moved through them with the slight uncertainty of someone in an Escher drawing. The light was different here. No longer the amber warmth of the shuttle but something cooler and more complex, light that came from no single visible source but seemed to permeate the walls themselves, varying in intensity and patterns that Elena began, after about 10 minutes of walking, to suspect were not random. They were greeted by two beings who emerged from a doorway, and doorway was Elena's best available word, though it was not quite right, and stood waiting as the human delegation approached. The Vorith were tall. That much Elena had expected from the corridor dimensions. What she had not expected was the quality of stillness they carried, an absolute, settled quality that was not like human stillness at all. Not the stillness of something waiting or something hiding, but the stillness of something that had simply, completely arrived at where it was and saw no reason to announce this with movement. They were bilaterally symmetrical, which Elena found obscurely reassuring. 4 limbs, 2 that clearly functioned as legs, 2 that were more ambiguous, capable of serving as either arms or a secondary pair of legs depending on the posture. Their coloring was a deep, iridescent blue-black that Elena recognized immediately as matching the hull of the ship, and she filed that detail as probably significant without yet knowing why. Their faces were, she struggled for the word, composed. Not expressionless but controlled, every micro-movement deliberate and legible if you knew how to read it, which Elena did not yet but intended to. The one on the left made a sound. Elena's translation equipment, a device developed over the past 3 weeks by her team in Prius, the most sophisticated real-time alien language processor ever built, running on hardware that she had personally helped configure, rendered the sound into words in her earpiece. The words were, "You are the ones who said the word." It was not a question. It was a statement of recognition, the same kind of statement you might make if someone you had heard of but never met walked into a room and you understood immediately who they were. Elena stepped forward. "Yes," she said. "We are." The room they were brought to for the hearing was vast and circular and had no chairs. Or rather, it had no human chairs. It had raised platforms at various heights, distributed throughout the space in a pattern that felt organic rather than arranged, and it had the Vorith equivalents of seating, low, curved structures that the delegation from the vessel settled into with the fluid ease of long practice. A secondary structure had been prepared along one section of the room's perimeter, lower platforms that were close enough to human-scale seating to be usable, facing the primary arrangement. Elena's team settled into these without instruction. They had been briefed on as much of the protocol as they had been able to extract from the signal documentation, and one of the clearest elements of the protocol was this: Do not wait for direction on things you can figure out yourself. Across from them, on the higher platform, 7 Vorith were arranged in a configuration that Elena recognized from the signal data as the formal council review structure, the Coherence Committee. The committee members were still in that particular Vorith way, and yet not identical to each other. There were subtle variations in their posture, in the iridescent patterns on their surfaces, that conveyed differentiation without being obvious about it. Elena had spent 2 weeks studying what she could of Vorith social signaling. She read them now with the careful attention of a student who knows she hasn't finished studying. The one at the center of the committee, the most senior she believed based on postural indicators, spoke first. Her translation system rendered it, "We have reviewed the record of your species' response to the founding invitation." Elena had noted, without comment, that the translation system consistently rendered what the tribute message had called a demand as an invitation. This was either an artifact of her translation choices or evidence that the Vorith had a different internal relationship to their own actions than their initial messaging suggested. She stored this observation for later. The committee member continued. The record shows an action that we have not previously observed in a first contact species. We have requested this hearing to understand it more fully. James, beside Elena, shifted very slightly, not in discomfort but in the way he shifted when he was calibrating what to say and needed a second to do it. Elena spoke first. "We'd be glad to answer your questions," she said. There was a pause, not uncomfortable but definite. The kind of pause that precedes something considered. The committee member said, "Before questions we will tell you what we observed so that you may correct us if our understanding is wrong." Elena found this protocol, the acknowledgement that their understanding might be wrong, the explicit invitation to correct, interesting. She filed it. "We observed," the committee member continued, "that when you received the founding invitation, you disclosed its contents to your entire species population. Not selectively. Not gradually. Completely. Before any decision had been made." "Yes," Elena said. "Why?" There was a quality to the question that Elena recognized, the same quality as the buried 4-channel question from the original signal. Genuine curiosity. Not as a rhetorical device, not as a trap, but as an actual inquiry from a mind that actually wanted to know. Because, Elena said carefully, the decision affected every single person on our planet. And in our system of values, people who are affected by a decision have a right to know about it and, where possible, to participate in making it. Pause. Even when full disclosure increases the risk of panic and irrational response? Yes, Elena said. Because the alternative, concealing the truth to manage the response, would mean that we had decided for ourselves that certain people's fear was a reason to remove their right to know. And that is not a decision we're willing to make. That is not a rational position, the committee member said. Not harshly, observationally, the way a scientist notes an unexpected result. By some definitions of rational, no, Elena said. But we have found in our history that decisions made in secret on behalf of people who were not consulted tend to produce worse outcomes than decisions made openly, even when the open process is messier and more frightening. We have found, she paused, choosing her words with precision. We have found that the messiness of truth is preferable to the neatness of managed deception. For us. That may not hold for every species. A silence. Then, from a committee member on the left, one who had not spoken yet, one whose surface pattern was slightly different from the others in a way Elena couldn't fully parse. Your species argued. After the disclosure. Publicly. There was significant disagreement about how to respond. There was, Elena said. And yet a coherent response was produced. Yes. How? Elena looked at James. James spoke for the first time since the hearing began. We listened to all of it, he said. His voice was even and clear. We didn't suppress the disagreement. We let it run. And then we tried to find what was true in all of it, what all the different voices, even the ones saying very different things, were actually trying to protect. And what were they trying to protect? Each other, James said simply. In different ways. Some people wanted to comply to protect the people they loved from physical destruction. Some people wanted to refuse to protect the people they loved from a future of subjugation. Some people were afraid. Some people were angry. All of them were trying to protect something. And the thing they were all trying to protect, he paused, was the same thing. A silence. What thing? The committee member asked. The people next to them, James said. The specific, individual, irreplaceable people in their immediate lives. That's what humans protect. Not abstractions. Not geopolitical positions. The people next to them. The silence that followed this was different from the previous silences. It had a different quality, a density, a weight, that Elena could feel even without knowing how to read Vorith nonverbal signals. The Central Committee member spoke again. The individual who constructed the linguistic response, it said. The word that was transmitted. Who was that? Elena said, I constructed it. With guidance and input from my team and from my colleague Mr. Callaway. You chose the coherence concept, the committee member said. The elevated form. The one reserved for the highest status within our system. I did, Elena said. Why that term? Because it was the most accurate one available in your language for what I was trying to communicate, Elena said. And because I thought, she paused. She was aware that this next part was risky, that she was about to say something that could be read as presumptuous or challenging. She said it anyway. I thought that if you had a term for that concept at the highest level of your value system, it was because you recognized the concept as important. And I thought that recognizing us with that term, not asking for it but using it as the word for what we demonstrated, was a way of speaking to what I believed was your highest values, rather than your standard operating procedure. A very long silence. Then the committee member said something that Elena's translation system rendered with a flag indicating uncertainty. A flag that meant the system had found a translation but was not fully confident it was accurate. The translation was, you spoke to us in our own deepest language. Elena looked at the flag. She looked at the translation. Yes, she said. I tried to. Another silence. Longer than any that had come before. And then something happened that was entirely outside Elena's prepared framework, outside the protocol documentation, outside everything she had studied and anticipated and planned for. The Vorith committee members moved. Not in alarm. Not in threat. A slow, deliberate movement, all 7 of them simultaneously, that shifted their postural configuration from the formal hearing arrangement to something different. Something that Elena had seen in the signal archive exactly once, in a section she had tentatively labeled ritual acknowledgement. A configuration that her notes described as, used in contexts of significant recognition between parties of equivalent standing. She stared at them. Then she looked at James. He was looking at her. In his eyes, in the gray of his eyes that was not cold but warm and complicated and present, she saw the same thing she was feeling, the enormity of it, the impossible magnitude of this moment, and underneath it, holding it, the simple and steady human fact of 2 people being here together for it. She reached out under the table of her platform. She found his hand. She held it as the Vorith completed their movement of acknowledgement, as the chamber filled with a sound she would later describe as the most beautiful thing she had ever heard, low and resonant and complex, the sound of 7 alien voices making something together that had no human name. She held his hand and she looked at the stars through the transparent section of the vessel's wall, and she thought, Caro, from this moment we are not alone. The coherence hearing lasted 6 hours. Not 6 hours of formal testimony. That portion concluded after about 90 minutes. What followed was something else, something that the committee members initiated by shifting their postural configuration again, this time to an arrangement that Elena's translation system flagged as informal exchange. And that turned out to be, in effect, a conversation. A genuine conversation. Questions asked from actual curiosity, answers given from actual honesty, an exchange of information and perspective and genuine mutual puzzlement that was unlike anything Elena had expected to experience with an alien species and that left her, at the end of 6 hours, feeling more deeply understood than she had felt by most humans in the last 5 years. The Vorith were curious about everything. About art. The concept that a species would invest significant resources in creating things whose only function was to be experienced, whose only purpose was the experience itself. About love. Elena spent 40 minutes on this one, which was the most challenging translation she attempted in the entire hearing, because there was no term in the Vorith lexicon that mapped precisely onto the human concept of love in its fullest sense. She ended up constructing a compound term, building it from the Vorith components for recognition, continuance, investment, and, after considerable thought, the elevated form of coherence concept. She described love, in Vorith, as something approximately equivalent to the act of recognizing another being as irreplaceable and organizing your actions around the continuance of what makes them so. The committee member who had been sitting on the left, the one whose surface pattern was different, asked to follow up, do humans love things that are not other humans? Yes, Elena said. Places. Ideas. Other living things. Some of us love the work we do. Some of us love the universe. Love the universe, the committee member repeated. Explain. Elena thought for a moment. There are people among us, she said, who have spent their entire lives studying the universe. Not because it is useful. Not because it provides resources or strategic advantage. Because they find it beautiful. Because the act of understanding something vast and complex and indifferent gives them a feeling that they consider worth organizing their entire lives around. You find beauty in the indifferent, the committee member said. Yes, Elena said. This is unusual, the committee member said. And then, after a pause, this may be the most unusual thing about your species. James made a small sound beside her, not quite a laugh but in that direction. Elena would agree with that, he said quietly for her ears only. She looked at him. Don't say it, she said. I wasn't going to, he said with that small, careful smile. At the end of 6 hours, the committee member in the center spoke the words that ended the hearing. Elena's translation system rendered them with full confidence and no flags. The review is complete. The determination of the committee will be transmitted to the full council. Pending council ratification, the founding tribute requirement for the human species is suspended indefinitely, pending the development of a modified engagement framework appropriate to the demonstrated nature of the species. Pause. The council has not previously made this determination for any species in the 37 who comprise its membership. The human species represents a new category. Another pause. Longer. We do not yet have a word in our language for what you are. Elena looked at the committee member for a moment. Then she said carefully in her best approximation of the Vorith language, neither do we. We've been working on it for a long time. The chamber was still. And then the committee member made a sound that Elena's translation system, after a 3.2-second processing delay, rendered as probable emotional expression, category, recognition of shared experience, confidence, 67%. Elena decided to interpret this as the Vorith equivalent of laughter. She smiled. They were escorted back to the shuttle by the same 2 Vorith who had met them on arrival. The walk through the vessel's corridors felt different on the return. The same impossible curves, the same permeating light, but Elena moved through it differently now, with less uncertainty and more of the open attention she brought to things she was still learning but no longer feared. At the threshold of the shuttle, the escort made a gesture. A deliberate, formal gesture that Elena recognized from the signal documentation as a form of acknowledgement used between parties who intended to continue their relationship. She returned it as accurately as she could manage. The Vorith escort regarded her for a moment with the absolute stillness of its kind. Then it did something unexpected. It placed one of its secondary limbs, briefly, lightly, on Elena's arm. A touch that lasted less than a second. Not quite human in its nature, not quite human in its texture, but unmistakably communicative. Unmistakably warm. Elena held very still. Then she nodded. She boarded the shuttle. The descent back to Earth took the same time as the ascent. Silent, smooth, the gravity of the planet reasserting itself so gradually that there was no distinct moment when Elena could say, "Now I am back." It happened in increments, the way most important things happen, the way the sky lightened from black to deep indigo to the pale gray of a winter dawn, until suddenly they were below the clouds and Geneva was below them and the field was there, gray and silver in the early morning. They landed. The shuttle opened. Elena stepped out onto the grass of Earth. She stood still for a moment with the cold February air on her face and the grass wet and real under her feet and the smell of it, the particular, immediate, irreplaceable smell of earth ground in winter, filling her chest until there was no room for anything else. James stepped out beside her. He stood close. Not touching. But present the way he was always present. Fully, attentively, without performance. She turned to look at him. He looked back. HFY, she said softly. From this moment. He understood. From this moment, he said. She took a breath of the cold earth air. We should go brief the Secretary General, she said. In a minute, he said. She looked at him. James? 1 minute, he said. Just 1 minute. Let's just be here for 1 minute before we go back inside and it becomes something that happened instead of something that's happening. She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned back to look at the sky, gray and real and full of a pale winter light that was not the amber glow of a Vorith shuttle or the cold black of space but simply the ordinary, extraordinary light of an Earth morning. 1 minute, she agreed. They stood together in the field in the cold morning air, the grass wet at their feet, the sky above them full of clouds and somewhere behind the clouds, stars. 1 minute. Then they went inside. The months that followed were simultaneously the most chaotic and the most important in human history, and Elena experienced them the way she had learned to experience most important things, from the inside with full attention without any particular illusion that she could see the whole picture from where she was standing. The Council's formal ratification of the Coherence Committee's determination came 6 weeks after the hearing. The founding tribute was officially, permanently suspended. In its place, the Council proposed, and this was the word they used, proposed, with an explicit acknowledgement that the proposal could be modified in negotiation, a framework of voluntary exchange. Scientific and cultural information, shared on mutually agreeable terms, with no coercive component. An invitation to participate in the galactic community not as a subject species that had complied with a demand but as a member species that had been recognized. The world reacted with 4 weeks of sustained, complicated emotion that defied easy categorization. There was joy, yes. There was relief. There was an enormous and somewhat overwhelming wave of national pride that expressed itself differently in every country and culture but essentially said, "We did it, humans did it, we stood up and we were ourselves and it worked." There were also, inevitably, political arguments about what the framework meant and who had the authority to negotiate its terms and what humanity's relationship with the Council should look like going forward. There were philosophical debates about the implications of being a new category, what that meant, what it required, what it said about the other 37 species. And there was, quiet and persistent under all of it, a question that Elena saw emerging in the global conversation with the regularity of a tide. What do we do now? She didn't have a complete answer to this question. She was honest about that. But she had the beginning of one and she began to articulate it, in reports, in interviews, in the long, careful conversations she continued to have with Priya and with James and with the Vorith liaison who had been established as the ongoing point of contact between the Council and Earth. The beginning of the answer was this: the same thing we always do. We keep going. We keep arguing. We keep figuring it out together, messily and imperfectly, the way we always have. And now we do it with the knowledge that the universe has noticed this about us and found it, in some fundamental way, admirable. She found that this was enough. Not everything, not a complete program or a clear path, but enough. The beginning of something. The Council liaison was named Vorith 7 of Inquiry, a designation that Elena's team had translated as indicating a role rather than a personal name, equivalent to something like the Inquiry Representative, and it arrived on Earth 12 weeks after the hearing, to begin the process of establishing permanent communication channels and exchange protocols. Elena was part of the team that received it. She found the experience of working with an alien colleague day to day to be, human was the word that kept occurring to her, which she recognized as paradoxical and didn't care. Vorith 7 of Inquiry was curious and precise and occasionally wrong in ways that it acknowledged without embarrassment and corrected without drama. It asked about coffee. It spent an extended period of time examining a vending machine in the UN corridor with what Elena eventually classified as fascinated confusion. It was occasionally baffled by human humor, which led to several excellent explanations of why certain things were funny that Elena thought were, collectively, a more illuminating exploration of human nature than most of the anthropology texts she had read. It asked her once, in the 4th week of its presence, the one called James Callaway. He is important to you in the coherence concept sense. Elena looked at it. Yes, she said. You recognize him as irreplaceable. Yes, she said again. And he recognizes you as irreplaceable. I believe so, she said. This is the love concept, Vorith 7 of Inquiry said. Not as a question. Yes, Elena said. This is the love concept. We do not have an equivalent, it said. Not with sadness, just with precision. Our bonding structures are differently organized. I know, Elena said. I've read what you've shared with us about your social architecture. Does that seem... It paused, and Elena recognized the pause as the one that preceded a question it wasn't certain it had the right vocabulary for. Incomplete? To you? She thought about it carefully. Different, she said. Not incomplete. Different. We're shaped by what we need to survive and what we choose to value. You're shaped by what you need and what you choose. The shapes aren't the same. She looked at it. But I hope, that's not a barrier. Between us. No, Vorith 7 of Inquiry said. I do not believe it is. It made the gesture of formal acknowledgement. Elena returned it. They went back to work. 3 months after the hearing, on a clear evening in April, James asked Elena to have dinner with him. Not a working dinner, not a meal consumed alongside a briefing document or a late-night strategy session. Dinner. Just dinner. She said yes. They went to a small restaurant on the edge of Lake Geneva that a UN colleague had recommended, and they sat at a table by the window with the lake outside and the mountains beyond it and the spring evening coming down slowly over everything, and they ordered food and ate it and talked, not about the council, not about the framework negotiations, not about the Vorith or humanity or the galactic community or any of the vast and important things that constituted the context of everything they did. They talked about his mother, who lived in Portland, Oregon, and who had apparently watched the entire 9-day crisis coverage without sleeping more than 2 hours at any one time. They talked about Elena's grandmother in Cedar Falls, who had died 3 years ago, and who had given Elena her first astronomy book when she was 7, a battered paperback with a cracked spine that Elena still had in a box in her apartment in Toronto. They talked about a film they had both independently seen and loved when they were teenagers, an old science fiction film from the early part of the century, about a woman who spent her life listening to the stars, and what happened when the stars finally answered. Neither of them said anything explicit about the parallel. Neither of them needed to. After dinner they walked along the lake. April in Geneva was cold still, but the kind of cold that felt like a promise rather than a threat. The cold that knows spring is coming and is simply taking its time about stepping aside. The lake was very still. The lights of the city reflected in it, clean and clear. They walked for a while without talking. Then James stopped. Elena stopped beside him. He looked at the lake for a moment. Then he looked at her. "I want to say something," he said. "Then say it," she said. "I've been thinking about what Vorith 7 of Inquiry said, that concept of irreplaceability. The way you translated it. Recognizing another being as irreplaceable and organizing your actions around the continuance of what makes them so." He paused. "I've been thinking about whether that's true for me. Regarding you." She looked at him. "And," she said. "It's true," he said simply. "You're, the way you think. The way you work. The way you looked at me on day 5 when I walked into your office, like you were reading a signal. The way you held my hand in the hearing room when the Vorith made that sound." He paused. "The way you're looking at me right now." Elena was very still. "James," she said. "I know the situation is still complicated," he said. "I know there's more work to do and it's going to be significant work for a long time. I'm not asking for anything that disrupts the work. I just wanted—" He paused, and for the first time in all the months she had known him, James Callaway looked just slightly uncertain. "I wanted to say it. Because I think, honesty, right? We believe in honesty." She looked at him for a long moment. The lake was still behind him. The mountains were dark and quiet. "We believe in honesty," she said. She stepped forward. She reached up and put her hand against the side of his face, warm and real and present, the way everything about him was real and present. And she looked at him, at the gray of his eyes that were not cold but full of something steady and patient and genuinely, unmistakably warm. "I know what you are," she said softly. "I recognized you on day 5. He closed his eyes briefly at that. When he opened them she was still there looking at him. He covered her hand with his. "HFY," he said. "From this moment." "From this moment," she said. And she kissed him, there by the lake, in the cold April evening, with the mountains dark above them and the stars just beginning to appear in the eastern sky, Henry and Mama and all the others, and beyond them, somewhere in the great dark, the iridescent hull of a vessel that had come to test humanity and found, in the testing, something it had not expected. Something the universe, it turned out, had never seen before. A year passed. The way years pass when the world is being remade, quickly and slowly at the same time, full of days that felt ordinary until you looked back at them and saw they weren't. The council framework was negotiated, revised, renegotiated, and finally ratified by the UN General Assembly on a warm October morning with a vote of 193 in favor and 0 opposed and 7 abstentions from nations that wanted the record to show their continued principled objection to the process even as they acknowledged it was happening. Elena watched the vote count from the observation gallery with Priya on one side and James on the other, and when the final tally appeared on the board, Priya made a small, sharp sound that was absolutely not a sob and immediately denied being anything of the sort, and Elena laughed and put her arm around her. The exchange programs began. Slowly at first, careful, structured, limited in scope. Scientific information moving in both directions. Cultural documentation. The Vorith lexicon and Earth's languages building toward each other like two hands reaching across a gap. Vorith 7 of Inquiry became a permanent fixture at the UN complex, increasingly fluent in English and utterly baffled by sports, which it studied with the serious attention it brought to everything and was no closer to understanding at the end of the year than the beginning. The world changed. And also, in the ways that mattered most to the individual human beings inside it, it didn't. People fell in love. People had children. People argued about traffic and politics and the best way to make coffee and whether the new Vorith exchange representative was or wasn't friendlier than Vorith 7 of Inquiry and whether this meant anything politically. People planted gardens and wrote music and told each other stories late at night. People sat on rooftops and named the stars and did not yet know what those names would mean to them later. Elena's mother came to visit Geneva for 2 weeks in the spring and was, characteristically, less impressed by the alien vessel that was still visible in the clear nights as a steadily moving light than she was by the restaurant James took them to on their second evening, where she ate the most extraordinary sea bass of her life and told James, with the direct simplicity of a woman who had decided to skip all the customary preamble, that she was glad Elena had found someone who listened. James, who had also decided to skip the customary preamble, said, "So am I." Elena's mother looked at Elena. Elena looked at James. Something passed between them that was quiet and specific in theirs. On the anniversary of the first signal, a date that had been designated by the UN as First Contact Day and celebrated globally with a mixture of civic ceremony and personal commemoration that reflected the enormous range of human ways of marking something, Elena and James went back to Cedar Falls, Iowa. It was Elena's idea. She wanted to go back to her grandmother's house. The house was a heritage site now, maintained by the city, because it was where Elena Mercer had spent her childhood, and Elena Mercer had become the kind of person whose childhood home was preserved. She found this both touching and slightly absurd, which was how she felt about most of the things that had happened to her in the past year. The roof was accessible by a ladder that the heritage site maintenance staff had added for her specific use, which she had been told about and found both considerate and unnecessary. She climbed it anyway. James climbed it behind her. The roof was the same. The shingles were new, the old ones had been replaced at some point in the last decade, but the slope of it was the same, and the view from it was the same, and the smell of it was the same, and the feeling of lying flat on it with your arms out and your eyes open to the sky was exactly the same as it had been when Elena was 8 years old and naming the stars. She lay back. She looked up. The sky over Cedar Falls was clear and very dark and full of stars. A good sky, a Midwestern sky, the kind of sky that reminds you the universe is genuinely enormous and that this is, depending on the moment, either terrifying or wonderful. James lay beside her. They were quiet for a while. "Which one is Henry?" he said. She smiled. She pointed. "There. The steady one south of Orion. He never flickers." James looked. "He doesn't," he said. "Good name. And Mama." She pointed again. "The soft blue one near the horizon." James found it. "She's beautiful," he said. "She always comes back," Elena said. "Even after the long winters." They were quiet again. The stars turned above them with the slow, patient certainty of things that have been doing this for a very long time and intend to keep doing it. "Can I tell you something?" James said. "Yes," Elena said. "I've been thinking about the word. The one you sent them." "Coherence," she said. "The elevated form," he said. "The one you chose because it was their highest order value. The quality of being true to your declared nature." "Yes," she said. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "that the reason it worked, the reason one word was enough, wasn't just that it was in their language. It was that it described something real. Something we actually were. In that moment, under that pressure, with everything at stake, we actually were who we said we were." Elena was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said softly. "We were. Do you think we'll keep being?" James said. "As things get more complicated. As the framework develops and the politics get harder and the pressure comes from different directions." She thought about it seriously. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I think we'll try. I think we'll fail sometimes and try again. I think we'll argue about it publicly and get it wrong and get it right and get it wrong again." She paused. "That's also, I suppose, what we are." He turned his head to look at her. She turned her head to look at him. In the starlight, his face was the same face she had first seen walking through the door of her office in Canada. A little tired, a little patient, full of the complicated gray-eyed warmth that had become, over the past year, the most familiar sight in her daily life. "I love you," he said. She had known he was going to say it. She had known it the way she had known, in the last seconds before she finished decoding the Vorith signal, what the final message was going to contain, with a clarity that preceded the words themselves, a certainty that made the actual saying of them feel like confirmation of something already true. "I love you too," she said. Simple. Direct. The honest thing said plainly. He reached across the shingles and found her hand. She held it. Above them, the stars burned on, Henry steady in the south and Mama soft and blue near the horizon, and all the unnamed others, and somewhere among them, moving slowly and steadily in its orbit, a light that was the Vorith vessel, and beyond that light, at distances that made the mind go quiet with awe, 37 species living their lives in a galaxy that had just gotten one species larger. One species stranger. One species that had looked into the face of an ultimatum and answered it with a word. One species that had, in the most tested moment of its history, been exactly what it said it was. It would not always be that way. Elena knew this. The history of humanity was not a story of consistent coherence. It was a story of the gap between what people declared themselves to be and what they actually managed, of the long, imperfect, never-finished work of closing that gap. The work was not done. It would not be done in her lifetime or James's or their children's if they had children, or for generations beyond that. But they had been true once. Under pressure, under threat, at the edge of everything, they had been true. And it had been enough. One word had been enough. Somewhere in the vast bureaucratic machinery of the Interstellar Council, a document had been filed, the formal record of Earth's first contact classification, the official notation of the Council's determination following the coherence hearing. The document was 37 pages long in the Vorith filing language, dense with protocol and procedure and formal categorization markers. But the operative line, the line that actually mattered, the line that described humanity's position in the Council record for all future reference, was a single sentence. Elena had received a translated copy of this sentence 6 months ago, through the official diplomatic channel. She had read it, filed it in her professional records, and told almost no one about it, not because it was classified, but because she wasn't yet sure she had words for what it made her feel. She had printed it out though. Small on a piece of paper. She kept it in her wallet. On the roof of her grandmother's house in Cedar Falls, Iowa, with James's hand warm in hers and the stars burning above them and the universe more populous and more mysterious than it had ever been before, she thought about that sentence. Read. Species designation, human. Classification, coherent in crisis. Distinction, the first species in Council record to answer a demand with a demonstration of its own nature, and to have that nature recognized as constituting, in itself, a sufficient response. And beneath that, in the elevated ceremonial form that Elena had constructed and sent across the silence of space, and that the Council had returned to them in this document as a mark of formal recognition. The quality of a civilization that is true to its own declared nature. Integrity. The word humanity had sent into the dark. The word the dark had sent back. Elena looked up at the stars. She thought about her grandmother, who had given her a battered paperback with a cracked spine and changed the direction of her entire life with a single gift. She thought about the night 9 days before first contact, lying on this same roof, in this same dark, when the stars were still just stars. She thought about the morning she had decoded the signal, and said oh into the quiet of a Canadian night. She thought about a tall man walking through a door with a manila folder, asking if she was Dr. Mercer. She thought about a word, constructed with care from the building blocks of an alien language, sent out across the silence with 12 minutes to spare, carrying everything that humanity was and everything it hoped to be. She thought about a coherence hearing on a starship, and a sound like the most beautiful music she had ever heard, and an alien touch on her arm that lasted less than a second and meant something she would spend years understanding. She thought about the cold February grass and the April lake and a man's hand over hers and words said simply, without ceremony because they were true. She thought about Caro, the moment before everything changed when she had pressed her hand flat against a screen full of alien light and felt the universe pressing back. She tightened her hand around James's. He tightened his around hers. Above them, the stars kept their ancient, faithful watch. And humanity, messy and brilliant and frightened and brave and absolutely, stubbornly, irrevocably itself, kept going. The ends.